I was part of the delegation that went to Victor Verster on the day of his release. We then drove back in entourage to the Grand Parade. And as you know, we couldn't get in. We were surrounded by the crowds. We ended up in Rondebosch. We didn't have cell phones, so we couldn't communicate with the Grand Parade. Jay said, "But Salim, don't you live close by?" So I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, let's go to your house." We ended up at my parents' place in Rondebosch East. And that was the first house and place that Madiba went to on his release from prison. It was a huge honor and privilege for the family to have hosted him, even though most of them were at the Grand Parade waiting for him. And so we settled him down. He had a cup of tea. We were then able to communicate with the Grand Parade through the landline. And they then gave us the go-ahead when to return. And that's when we went back, and that's when he addressed the crowd.
When I won Miss South Africa in 1990, I remember receiving a call from Zelda saying that the president would like to speak to you. Of course, I took the call, and on the other line, there was his voice. And one of my heartwarming, fondest memories was when I won Miss SA. My father was a bus driver and my mother was a teacher. And Madiba commissioned 10 designers to make me these garments because he felt that I was representing a new hope, a new generation of young leaders, and I was on the world stage because South Africa was on the world stage. And I walked out in confidence every time I was on the world stage.
It was a Saturday afternoon and I worked for radio station Lotus FM at the time. And I got a call on my cell phone from our station manager, Khalik Sheriff. He says, "Well, I'm coming to fetch you because Mandela wants to see you." Khalik arrived, I got into the car, and that's when it all became very real, when we drove up to King's house. We were ushered into a huge room, a very long table. In walked Nelson Mandela, and there was this big hush, and he walked around the entire room shaking hands with everybody, and then he came to me and he shook my hand and he said, "Aren't you supposed to be in school?" I had this burning desire to tell President Nelson Mandela that I knew why many South Africans of Indian descent were feeling the way that they were. While he was talking, I put up my hands. I said, "Excuse me, Mr. Mandela." I'll never forget it. And he said, "And what would you like to say?" And then I said, people need to feel that they belong. And the only person who can do that is you, which is why, Mr. President, I'd like to invite you onto my talk show.
So this was on Arbor Day. It was in Alexandra, and I had just won some public speaking competition. I was in high school, my final year of high school, and I was invited to this tree planting ceremony. I felt just incredibly lucky to be in the man's presence, much less to speak to him. But the interesting story that I tell wherever I go and to anyone who will hear it is that, in fact, it was I who was responsible for Madiba's change of style in terms of what he looked like. Because until that moment, and even on that day, he's wearing a suit and tie. It was hot, and it was at a tree planting ceremony, and he's wearing a suit and tie. And what was I wearing? I was wearing what later became known as the Madiba shirt. It was a paisley shirt, and that's what teenagers of the time found particularly stylish. I think he looked at me and he said, "Well, young man, you are onto something there." Because thereafter, you never saw him in public, certainly not in the African heat, wearing a suit and tie.